Welcome to London Gritty Chronicles. The year is 1360. Stand with me for a moment on the cobblestones of London. Close your eyes. Listen to the city. It is loud. It is busy. It is alive. You hear the iron clang of the blacksmith's hammer. You hear the heavy wooden wheels of carts rolling over stone, carrying wool and grain. You hear laughter spilling out of the taverns. This noise is beautiful. Do you know why? Because just 10 years ago, there was only silence. 10 years ago, the great pestilence, what we now call the Black Death, tore through this city like a wildfire. It took nearly half the population. It left streets empty. It left houses cold. It left a scar on the soul of humanity. But humans are resilient. That is a powerful word, resilient. It means able to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. By 1360, the people of England believed they had survived the apocalypse. They thought the worst was behind them. They were wrong. The end of a disaster is rarely a clean line. In history, and in life, trauma does not just vanish. It lingers. It waits in the shadows. And sometimes, when you least expect it, it returns. In this series, we are going deep into the years 1361 and 1362. We are exploring the second wave of the plague. We will uncover why it came back, who it targeted, and how it shattered the fragile hope of a recovering world. Along the way, we will master the English language of uncertainty, recurrence, and aftermath. Let us begin with the illusion of safety. To understand the horror of 1361, you must first feel the optimism of 1359. Picture a young laborer named Thomas. He survived the first wave in 1348. He was just a boy then. Now, in his 20s, he finds himself in a strange new world. Because so many people died in the first wave, workers are scarce. This means Thomas is valuable. For the first time in history, a peasant can demand higher wages. He can eat meat, not just bread. He wears a tunic made of decent wool, not rags. Historians call this the golden age of the laborer. It was a paradox. A paradox is a situation that seems impossible or contradictory, yet is true. Out of death came a better life for the survivors. Thomas walks through the markets of Cheapside. He sees silver coins changing hands. He sees ships arriving in the port of London, their masts standing tall against the grey sky. He thinks, "It is over. God has punished us, and now He has forgiven us." This was the collective mood. The psychological state of England was one of relief. They had looked into the abyss, and they had stepped back. But biology does not care about human hope. While Thomas counts his coins, something is happening beneath the floorboards. Something is happening in the dark corners of the grain warehouses. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, did not leave England. It did not sail away on the ships. It merely went underground. Here is a key English phrase for you. To lie dormant. To lie dormant means to be inactive, to sleep, but to remain alive and capable of waking up. A volcano can lie dormant. A virus can lie dormant. For 10 years, the plague lay dormant in the animal reservoirs of England. It hid in the rat populations. It moved silently through the countryside, perhaps killing a few people here and there, isolated cases that no one noticed. But it was waiting. It was waiting for the right conditions to resurface. Listen to that word. Resurface. Resurface. It comes from the idea of something underwater coming back to the top. In history, old problems often resurface. Old conflicts resurface. And in 1361, the pestilence resurfaced. Why? Why did it return after a decade of quiet? There are three main theories, and we will explore them all. But the most chilling reason involves immunity. Immunity is your body's defense system. If you catch a disease and survive, your body often learns how to fight it. You become immune. The survivors of 1348, people like Thomas, had immunity. They had faced the demon and won. The bacteria could not easily kill them again. But what about the children? What about those born after 1348? By 1361, there was a whole new generation of children in England, children who were 5, 8, or 10 years old. They had never been exposed to the plague. Their bodies were defenseless. To the bacterium, these children were dry wood, ready to burn. This is why the outbreak of 1361 has a terrible, specific name in the chronicles. In Latin, they called it pestis puerorum. In English, the children's plague. Imagine the horror of a society that thinks it is safe, only to watch its children fall sick. The return began slowly. It didn't explode all at once. It started with rumors. A merchant traveling from France brings news of a mortality in the south. A letter arrives from a bishop in York mentioning sudden fevers. At first, people dismissed it. Denial is a powerful force. We often refuse to believe bad news until it is standing on our doorstep. We use the phrase, to turn a blind eye. This means to pretend not to see something that you know is happening. The lords and the wealthy turned a blind eye. They continued their feasts. King Edward III was busy with his wars and his politics. But you cannot ignore a biological reality. In the spring of 1361, the winds changed. The air grew heavy. And then, the reports became too frequent to ignore. In a small village outside London, a family falls ill. Not the father, not the mother, just the 3 youngest children. They developed the telltale signs. The swellings in the neck and groin. The dark patches on the skin. The parents recognize it instantly. They remember 1348. The terror that rushes through their veins is colder than any winter frost. "It is back," they whisper. This moment, the realization, is what we call a rude awakening. A rude awakening is a shock that forces you to face a difficult truth. England was about to have a very rude awakening. The Golden Age was a mirage. The stability was fragile. As we move through this documentary, keep your ears open for words that describe time and repetition. History is a cycle. You will hear words like recurrence. A recurrence is when something happens again. You will hear outbreak. An outbreak is a sudden start of something bad, like war or disease. You will hear persistent. Persistent means continuing firmly, refusing to stop or go away. The plague was persistent. But 1361 was different from 1348. The first wave was a hammer blow that crushed everyone, rich, poor, young, old. The second wave was a sniper. It selected its targets. It hunted the young, and, strangely, it hunted the rich. Why the rich? Why the nobility? That is a mystery we will unravel. But for now, I want you to sit with the feeling of the year 1361. The markets are still open, the blacksmith is still hammering, but there is a new tension in the air. People are glancing over their shoulders. Parents are keeping their children indoors. The silence of the dead is returning. The end of the Black Death was a lie. The intermission is over. The second act is about to begin. And this time, the enemy knows exactly who to strike. We left England standing on the edge of a cliff, blind to the danger below. We learned that the plague had been sleeping, waiting for a new generation. But how did it wake up? And why did this second wave strike down the people who thought they were untouchable? To understand this, we must look at the top of the social ladder. Imagine the most powerful man in England who is not the king. His name is Henry of Grosmont, the Duke of Lancaster. He is a warrior, a diplomat, and a fabulously wealthy landowner. Henry is a survivor. He lived through the first apocalypse of 1348. He believes, like many others, that God has spared him for a reason. He feels invincible. Invincible means too powerful to be defeated or overcome. It is March 1361. Spring is arriving. The crocuses are pushing through the snow. Henry is in his castle in Leicester. He feels a sudden chill. It is not the weather. Within days, the mighty Duke is dead. His death sent a shockwave through England. If the plague could take the Duke of Lancaster, a man with the best food, the thickest walls, and the finest doctors, then who was safe? The answer was no one. This death highlights a strange characteristic of the 1361 outbreak. While it is famously called the Children's Plague, it also targeted adult men, particularly the nobility. Chroniclers of the time noted this oddity. One monk wrote that this wave was the death of men. Why? Historians suggest it was because of travel. Let's learn a crucial English phrase: to be on the move. To be on the move means to be traveling or relocating. In 1361, the men of England were on the move. The year before, in 1360, England and France signed a treaty. It was called the Peace of Bretigny. The long war paused. Thousands of English soldiers, knights, and archers packed up their camps in France and sailed home. They were happy. They were returning to their wives and families. They brought with them gold, wine, and silk. But they also brought an invisible stowaway. In biology, we call this a vector. A vector is an organism or vehicle that transmits a disease from one place to another. These soldiers acted as vectors. They carried the infected fleas on their clothes. They carried the bacteria in their blood. They marched from the ports of the south straight into the heart of the English towns. And who did they unknowingly infect first? Their own families. This brings us back to the most tragic victims of 1361, the children. We touched on this earlier, but we need to deepen our understanding. The English word for this concept is susceptibility. Susceptibility is the state of being likely to be influenced or harmed by a particular thing. If you leave iron in the rain, it has a high susceptibility to rust. The children born after 1348 had 100% susceptibility to the plague. Their immune systems were naive. In medicine, naive usually means inexperienced. A naive immune system has never seen the enemy before. It has no map, no weapons, and no defense. When the soldiers returned, hugging their sons and daughters, the bacteria jumped. The result was catastrophic. In the first wave of 1348, whole families died together. In 1361, the pattern changed. You would enter a house and find the parents weeping, alive and healthy, while 3 small coffins lay in the center of the room. If there are fewer children today, there will be fewer workers tomorrow. If there are fewer workers, who will harvest the grain in 10 years? Who will fight the king's wars? The survivors began to panic, not just because of death, but because the structure of their world was crumbling again. They had just started to rebuild. They had just started to trust the future. Now, that trust was broken. We often say, lightning never strikes the same place twice. This is an idiom meaning unusual events rarely happen again in the same way. But in 1361, the people of England learned that this idiom is false. Lightning does strike twice, and sometimes the second strike hurts more, because you promised yourself it wouldn't happen again. As the summer of 1361 heated up, the death toll rose. The heat helped the fleas reproduce. The roads were busy with summer fairs. The perfect storm had arrived. People began to ask desperate questions. Is this God's wrath again? Did we not pray enough? Is the air corrupt? They looked for someone to blame. They looked for a way to stop it. And this search for answers led to some strange and desperate behaviors. When humans feel helpless, they try to seize control in any way they can. In the next part, we will walk into the churches and the town halls. We will see how the institutions of England tried to fight an enemy they could not see. We will look at the frantic attempts to legislate, to pray, and to isolate. The second wave was not just a biological event. It was a test of sanity. The soldiers are home. The Duke is dead. The cradles are empty. What do you do when the nightmare returns? We watched the second wave steal the children of England. We saw the soldiers return as vectors of death. Now we turn our eyes to the towers of power. Imagine you are King Edward III. You are a warrior king. You have defeated the French. You have captured kings and castles. You know how to fight men who hold swords. But how do you fight an enemy that is invisible? How do you lay siege to a bacterium? In 1361, the most powerful institutions in England, the Crown and the Church, tried to fight back. They used the only weapons they had, laws and prayers. This brings us to a critical English concept, a measure. In this context, a measure is an action taken to achieve a purpose, usually to deal with a problem. Governments take measures to stop crime. In 1361, the king took measures to stop the plague. But these measures were desperate. First, let's look at the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Islip, was the spiritual leader of England. He looked at the dying children and the empty noble houses, and he did not see a biological event. He saw a spiritual failure. He believed the plague returned because people had forgotten to be good. In his eyes, the survivors of the first wave had become greedy. They wore flashy clothes. They drank too much ale. They demanded high wages. So, in 1361, the church issued a mandate. A mandate is an official order or commission to do something. The mandate was simple. Pray harder. Walk barefoot in the streets. Show God you are sorry. This is called penitence. Penitence is the action of feeling or showing sorrow and regret for having done wrong. Picture a procession in York. It is a rainy Tuesday. Hundreds of people are walking slowly through the mud. They are not wearing shoes. They are chanting low, mournful songs. They are whipping themselves. They believe that if they show enough pain, the plague will lift. It is a heartbreaking scene. We know today that gathering in large crowds actually helped the disease spread. The breath of the infected mixed with the breath of the healthy. The fleas jumped from one barefoot pilgrim to another. Their solution became part of the problem. This is a tragic irony. An irony is when the result of a situation is exactly the opposite of what was intended. While the church tried to save souls, the government tried to save the economy. The plague of 1361 was killing the workforce again. But remember the golden age we spoke of? The workers who survived were becoming powerful. They knew their value. If 20% of the village dies, the remaining men can ask for double the pay to harvest the wheat. The landowners panicked. They appealed to the king. "Stop them!" they cried. "Make them work for the old wages!" So, the king and his council tried to enforce the statute of laborers. This was a law passed after the first wave to freeze wages. They tried to revive it in 1361. Here is a useful phrase: to stem the tide. To stem the tide means to stop something from increasing or continuing. It comes from the image of stopping the ocean's water. King Edward tried to stem the tide of rising wages. He sent judges to the villages to fine workers who asked for too much money. He tried to force men to stay on their lord's land. But you cannot legislate against supply and demand, and you cannot arrest a microbe. The recurrence of the plague exposed the limits of authority. When a disaster happens once, people rally together. When it happens twice, the social fabric begins to tear. The recurrence in 1361 created a sense of cynicism. Cynicism is an attitude of scorn or negativity, a belief that people are motivated purely by self-interest. The people saw the priests dying, just like the sinners. They saw the rich dying, just like the poor. They saw the king's laws failing to stop the death or the hunger. A question began to whisper through the taverns. If the king cannot protect us, and the bishop cannot save us, why do we serve them? This is a dangerous question for any society. The second wave taught England a hard lesson about persistence. Persistence is the quality of continuing to exist or endure over a prolonged period. The plague was persistent. It was not a one-time visitor. It was a new resident. By the end of 1361, the graveyards were full again. The processions had failed. The laws were being ignored. But something else was happening. The reservoir of the disease was changing. We mentioned reservoirs earlier. In 1348, the plague came largely from black rats, but by 1361, historians debate if the disease had found other hosts. Perhaps it was lingering in the soil. Perhaps in human fleas. The science of transmission, how a disease moves, was a mystery to them. To them, it seemed like the air itself was poisonous. They called this miasma. Miasma is an old medical theory that diseases were caused by bad air or rotting matter. Because they believed in miasma, they cleaned the streets. They removed the butchers who threw animal blood into the river. They mandated that filth be carried out of the city. Ironically, these measures might have helped a little. Not because of bad air, but because less filth meant fewer rats. So, in a way, their wrong theory led to a right action. As 1361 turned into 1362, the dying slowed down. The second pestilence began to fade. But the England that emerged was not the same. It was harder, it was colder, and it was much, much angrier. The survivors of the second wave were not grateful like the survivors of the first. They were furious. They had lost their children. They had lost their faith in the system. And now they were about to use their scarcity as a weapon. In the next part, we will see the rise of the empowered peasant. We will see how the death of the nobility in 1361 left a power vacuum that the common people tried to fill. The plague killed the bodies, but it woke up the minds of the working class. The feudal system is about to take a heavy blow. We saw the church and the crown fail to stop the dying. The prayers did not work. The laws did not work. Now, we stand in the muddy fields of 1362. The second wave has passed, but the silence it left behind is deafening. Imagine a vast wheat field in Norfolk. The grain is golden and heavy, ready to be harvested. But there is a problem. There is no one to hold the scythe. The reaper is gone. The thresher is gone. The village that once had 50 strong men now has 30. And those 30 men know something very dangerous to the ruling class. They know they are essential. This brings us to a powerful English concept: leverage. Leverage is the power to influence a person or situation to achieve a particular result. It comes from the word lever, a tool used to lift heavy objects. In 1362, the peasant suddenly held the lever. Let's watch a scene. Lord William is a landowner. He owns the field. He is rich in land, but he is poor in labor. If the wheat is not harvested in 3 days, it will rot. He will lose everything. He rides his horse to the cottage of a peasant named John. 10 years ago, Lord William would have ordered John to work. He would have paid him pennies. If John refused, he would be punished. But today, Lord William is sweating. He looks at John. "John," he says, "I need you in the field. I will pay you the statutory wage, 2 pence a day." John leans on his doorframe. He looks at the rotting wheat. He looks at the desperate lord. "No, my lord," John says calmly. "The miller across the river offers 4 pence and a lunch of meat and ale. I will go there." This moment changes history. Lord William has a choice. He can call the sheriff to arrest John for breaking the statute of labourers. But the sheriff is busy burying his own cousin. And even if John is arrested, the wheat will still rot. So Lord William swallows his pride. 3 pence, he offers, and you can take some wood from the forest. 4 pence, John replies, and the wood. Lord William agrees. This interaction is what we call bargaining. To bargain is to negotiate the terms of an agreement. Before the plague, peasants did not bargain. They obeyed. Now, scarcity has created a market. Scarcity means the state of being in short supply. When labor is scarce, its value goes up. This is the first law of economics. The second wave of 1361 accelerated this. It killed the young and the fit. It created a vacuum in the workforce. A vacuum is a space entirely devoid of matter. In history, when a power vacuum or a labor vacuum opens, something must rush in to fill it. In 1362, what rushed in was ambition. The survivors of the second wave were not just happy to be alive. They wanted to live better. They saw their children die. They saw the randomness of death. They realized that life is short and authority is weak. Why suffer for a Lord who cannot protect you? We use the phrase, to seize the opportunity. This means to take advantage of a chance quickly and eagerly. The peasants seized the opportunity. They moved to towns. They took over empty farms. They demanded better food, better clothes, and better rights. Chroniclers of the time were horrified. One monk wrote that the common people were becoming arrogant and greedy. He complained that they dressed like knights and ate like kings. But to us, looking back, we see the birth of the middle class. We see the cracking of the feudal system. The feudal system relied on the idea that everyone stays in their place. The peasant stays at the bottom. The noble stays at the top. The plague shook this ladder until people started falling off or climbing up. However, this new power came with a dark side. The nobility did not give up easily. They were angry. They felt their world slipping away. This leads to resentment. Resentment is bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly. The lords resented the peasants. The peasants resented the lords. The tension in England was rising like steam in a pressure cooker. The second wave of 1361 to 1362 was the heat that kept the water boiling. It proved that the disaster was not a one-time event. It was a condition of life. This constant threat changed the psychology of the nation. People stopped planning for the distant future. They started living for the here and now. The here and now is a phrase meaning the present moment. If you might die next summer when the fleas return, why save your money? Why not buy the velvet coat? Why not drink the good wine? This fatalism, mixed with ambition, created a very specific atmosphere in the 1360s. It was a time of decay, but also a time of wild energy. But while the men were arguing over wages, the biological clock was still ticking. The plague had receded, but it had not vanished. It had just moved again. Where did it go? And what happens to a society that lives in permanent fear of the next wave? We have talked about the economy. In the next part, we must talk about the mind. We will explore the art and the literature that emerged from this darkness. How do you write poetry when half your audience is dead? How do you paint God when he seems to be killing children? We will look at the macabre. We saw the laborer rise up. We saw the economy turn upside down because of the shortage of men. Now, in Part 5, we look at the mind of 1362. When a society loses its children, and when the survivors realize that death can return at any moment, the culture changes. The art changes. The language changes. Walk into a church built in the 1360s. Look at the walls. Before the plague, the art was often glorious and distant. Saints with golden halos, kings with majestic crowns. But after the second wave, a new theme begins to bleed into the paint. You might see a painting of 3 rich kings riding horses, meeting 3 rotting skeletons. The skeletons speak to the kings. They say, "As you are, we once were. As we are, you shall be. This is the macabre. Macabre is an adjective used to describe something that is disturbing because it is related to death or injury. The second wave of 1361 cemented the macabre into the English imagination. It wasn't just a nightmare, it was a philosophy. It taught the idea of inevitability. Inevitability is the quality of being certain to happen. You cannot avoid it. The plague taught the peasant that the king dies just like the beggar. The bacteria does not care about your title. It does not care about your velvet. This realization sparked a strange kind of equality. If we are all equal in the grave, why are we not equal in life? This brings us to one of the most important moments in the history of the English language. A moment that happened right in the middle of this chaos, in October 1362. For centuries, the official language of power in England was not English. It was French. The king spoke French. The courts spoke French. The laws were written in Latin. English was the language of the dirt. It was the vernacular. Vernacular means the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. But in 1362, Parliament passed the Statute of Pleading. This law stated that because the French tongue is much unknown in the realm, all pleas in court should be debated, and judged in English. Why did this happen in 1362? Think about the death toll. The second wave killed many of the old lawyers, the old judges, and the old priests, the guardians of French and Latin. They were replaced by new men who were perhaps less educated in the old ways, men who spoke the language of the streets. The plague acted as a catalyst. A catalyst is a person or thing that precipitates an event. It speeds things up. The plague killed the gatekeepers of the French language. It forced the government to speak to the people in a way they understood. So, in a dark twist, the English language you are learning today owes a debt to the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Without the massive death tolls of the 1360s, English might have remained a second-class language for much longer. But while the language was rising, the mood was sinking. This was the era of a poet named William Langland. He wrote a massive poem called Piers Plowman. It is a difficult, angry, beautiful poem. It describes a world where money has corrupted the church, where the poor are suffering, where society is broken. Langland wrote about the wastures, the wasters. These were the wanderers, the people who refused to work because they had lost hope. He captured the feeling of disillusionment. Disillusionment is a feeling of disappointment resulting from the discovery that something is not as good as one believed it to be. The people of 1362 were disillusioned with their leaders. They saw the bishops getting rich while the poor died. They saw the knights failing to protect them. And yet, life had to continue. We use the phrase, to pick up the pieces. To pick up the pieces means to restore one's life or a situation after a disaster. In the late 1360s, England began to pick up the pieces. They changed their architecture. They stopped building the complex, flowery, decorated Gothic style. It was too expensive. It took too much time, and the master stonemasons were dead. They switched to a new style called perpendicular. It was straighter, simpler. It used less stone and more glass. It was practical. It was efficient. It was an architecture of survivors. They built huge windows to let in the light. Perhaps they were tired of the darkness. Perhaps they wanted to see clearly. So we have a changed landscape. The fields are partly empty, but the workers are paid more. The courts are speaking English. The churches are brighter, but the paintings on the walls remind you of death. The immediate crisis of the second wave is over. The children's plague has finished its feast, but the bacteria has not left the island. It has merely retreated to its reservoirs again. And now, a new problem arises. If 20% to 50% of the population is gone, who owns the land? There are thousands of acres with no clear owner. Entire families have been wiped out. The legal system is about to face a nightmare of inheritance, theft, and confusion. And in this confusion, a new kind of person emerges: the opportunist. In Part 6, we will look at the scramble for property. We will see how the map of England was redrawn not by war, but by wills and testaments. We will learn the language of inheritance and dispute, because when the owner dies, the neighbors do not always mourn. Sometimes they move the fence. We left the survivors standing in the new light of perpendicular windows, speaking English in their courts. But outside the church, a silent war was beginning. It was not a war of swords. It was a war of paper. It was a war of fences. Imagine a cottage in a valley. The chimney is cold. The garden is overgrown. The family who lived there, a father, a mother, and 3 sons, died in the outbreak of 1361. Who owns the cottage now? In normal times, the land goes to the heir. An heir is a person legally entitled to the property or rank of another on that person's death. Usually the eldest son. But in 1361, the heirs were dead. The children's plague had wiped out the next generation. The line of succession was broken. This created a legal vacuum, and into this vacuum stepped the opportunist. An opportunist is a person who exploits circumstances to gain immediate advantage rather than being guided by consistent principles or plans. Let us watch a man named Robert. Robert is a survivor. He lives next door to the empty cottage. He knows the family is gone. He knows the distant cousins live 3 villages away and are too scared to travel. So, one night, under the cover of darkness, Robert walks to the boundary line between his field and the empty field. He finds the heavy stone that marks the border. He digs it up. He moves it 10 yards into the empty land, then 20 yards. By morning, Robert's farm is bigger. We call this encroachment. Encroachment is the intrusion on a person's territory or rights. Robert is encroaching because there is no one left to stop him. Multiply this by thousands of villages. All over England, fences were moving. Cattle were grazing in fields that did not belong to their owners. Tools, pots, and clothes were disappearing from empty houses. It was a chaotic scramble for wealth. Historians call this the reshuffling of English society. The plague acted like a giant hand that shook the jar of land ownership. When the dust settled, the land was in new hands. This brings us to a complex English word, litigation. Litigation is the process of taking legal action. Because so many people were stealing land or claiming to be the true heir, the courts were flooded with lawsuits.
"That field is mine,"
cries the distant cousin. "No, I bought it before he died," lies the neighbor. "The king owns it," claims the official. The courts were overwhelmed. We say they had a backlog. A backlog is an accumulation of uncompleted work or matters that need to be dealt with. The legal system of 1362 was drowning in a backlog of property disputes. But for the survivors who managed to grab land, this was a windfall. A windfall is a piece of unexpected good fortune. The plague provided a grim windfall for the survivors. Suddenly, a peasant who used to own 5 acres might own 15. He could grow more food. He could sell the surplus. He could buy better clothes. This sounds good for the peasant, right? But it created a deep social tension. The old nobility, the people who had been rich for centuries, hated these new men. They looked down on them. They called them upstarts. An upstart is a person who has risen suddenly to wealth or high position, especially one who behaves arrogantly. The chroniclers of the time complained bitterly. They wrote, "The poor have become masters, and the masters have become poor." They saw the natural order of the world collapsing. But there was another player in this game of land grab, the biggest opportunist of all, the king. King Edward III was always in need of money. Wars are expensive. Castles are expensive. When a person died without any heirs at all, their land reverted to the lord or the king. To revert means to return to a previous state or owner. The king's officials, called escheators, rode across the country like vultures. They hunted for empty lands to claim for the crown. They were hated. They were feared. So you have a 3-way fight. The greedy neighbors moving fences, the distant relatives suing in court, the king's men seizing property. This chaos changed the personality of England. It made people more litigious, more likely to sue. It made them more suspicious. It also broke the old bonds of loyalty. Before the plague, you served your lord because his father served your father. It was tradition. After the plague, you served whoever paid the most. Or you served yourself. The idea of community was fracturing. We use the phrase, "every man for himself." This idiom describes a situation in which people do not help each other, and each person has to take care of their own interests. The aftermath of 1361 was a time of every man for himself. But as the peasants got richer and the landowners got poorer, the tension had to break somewhere. The government tried to stop the wages from rising, as we saw in Part 3. Now, they tried to stop the ambition from rising. They passed laws telling people what they could wear and what they could eat. These were called sumptuary laws. Imagine the government telling you, "You are a peasant. You cannot wear silver. You cannot wear silk. You cannot eat roasted meat every day." Why? Because the rich wanted to visually separate themselves from the upstarts. They wanted to spot the difference between a lord and a lucky peasant. But laws cannot turn back the clock. The genie was out of the bottle. The people of England had tasted a better life. They had survived the second wave. They had buried their children. And now, they wanted to enjoy what was left of their time on earth. They were not going to go back to eating watery soup and wearing rags. This clash between a rising people and a repressive government was setting the stage for an explosion. The plague had taught them that life is cheap, but it also taught them that labor is expensive. In the next part, we will see how this new confidence spilled over into violence. The countryside was becoming dangerous. Bands of men were roaming the roads. The law was losing its grip. We will learn the language of unrest and rebellion. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed their fear of authority. We saw neighbors stealing land and cousins fighting in court. We saw a society where the rules of property were dissolving. But theft is a quiet crime. It happens with a pen or a moved stone. In Part 7, the crime gets loud. The roads of England in 1362 were not safe. If you were a merchant carrying wool to London, you did not travel alone. You hired guards. You watched the tree line. Why? Because the plague and the peace had created a monster. Remember the soldiers we met in Part 2? The ones who came home from France in 1360? Many of them found their villages destroyed by the second wave. Their wives were dead. Their children were buried. Their farms were overgrown. They were trained to kill. They had no masters. They had no homes. So they turned to the only trade they knew: violence. We call these men brigands. A brigand is a member of a gang that ambushes and robs people in forests and mountains. In the 1360s, England was plagued by bands of brigands. They were not Robin Hood. They did not steal from the rich to give to the poor. They stole from everyone to keep for themselves. This surge in violence forces us to learn a frightening word: lawlessness. Lawlessness is a state of disorder due to a disregard of the law. The second wave of the plague broke the social contract. The social contract is an unwritten agreement. I will obey the king, and the king will protect me. But the king could not stop the bacteria, and the king could not stop the brigands. So men began to take the law into their own hands. This idiom means to punish someone for a crime according to one's own judgment, rather than waiting for the police or courts. If a brigand stole your cow, you didn't call the sheriff. The sheriff might be dead. You gathered your brothers, you took your bows, and you hunted the thief yourself. It was the Wild West, 500 years early. The government in Westminster was terrified. They saw the fabric of England unraveling. They knew that if they lost control of the countryside, they lost the kingdom. So, in 1361, right in the middle of the dying, they passed a historic law: the Justices of the Peace Act. This is a term you should know: Justice of the Peace, or JP. Before this, the king sent judges from London to visit towns once or twice a year. But that was too slow for the chaos of the plague years. The new act gave local lords the power to judge and punish criminals on the spot. They could arrest a man in the morning and hang him in the afternoon. It was a measure of desperation. Desperation is a state of despair, typically one that results in rash or extreme behavior. The king was desperate to restore order. He gave the JPs the power to restrain offenders, rioters, and all other barrators. A barrator is an old word for someone who incites trouble or lawsuits. But here is the twist. Who did the king choose to be these justices? He chose the wealthy landowners, the same men who were angry about rising wages, the same men who resented the upstart peasants. So, the law became a weapon of class warfare. If a peasant demanded higher wages, which was illegal under the Statute of Labourers, the Justice of the Peace, who was also his employer, could have him whipped or branded. This brings us to the word impunity. Impunity means exemption from punishment or freedom from the injurious consequences of an action. The rich acted with impunity. They used the new laws to crush the workers. They used the courts to steal land. The poor, meanwhile, had no impunity. If they stole a loaf of bread, they were hanged. If they asked for a raise, They were branded on the forehead with the letter F for falsity. Can you feel the pressure building? The plague of 1361 to 1362 did not just kill bodies, it killed fairness. It created a world where the survivors were locked in a bitter struggle. On one side, the elite, armed with new laws and old money, trying to force the world back to the way it was in 1340. On the other side, the common people, armed with scarcity and anger, realizing they were the engine of the economy. The children's plague had removed the middle generation. It left the very old, who wanted tradition, and the young, who wanted change. The clash was inevitable. As we move toward the end of our story, we must look at the legacy of this anger. The violence on the roads was just a symptom. The real disease was in the heart of the society. People began to organize. They began to whisper in the back of the taverns. Why should we suffer? Why is the bishop fat while we starve? Why did God spare us, only to let us be slaves? These whispers were the seeds of something huge. In the next part, we will explore the intellectual rebellion. We will meet the thinkers who started to question the church itself. The plague made people question God's representatives on earth. And a man named John Wycliffe was about to ask a question that would shake the foundations of Europe. The body is recovering, but the soul of England is in revolt. We walked the dangerous roads with brigands and thieves. We saw men taking the law into their own hands because the king could not protect them. But while the bodies were healing, the souls of England were still sick. The plague had broken the trust between the people and their spiritual fathers. Imagine it is a Sunday in 1363. You are a peasant named William. You are standing in a cold stone church. You look up at the pulpit. The priest standing there is not the wise old man who baptized you. That man died in the first wave. The priest standing there now is young. He is poorly educated. He rushes through the Latin prayers because he does not understand them. And worse, you saw him yesterday at the tavern, drinking with the tax collector. You think, if this man is God's representative, why is he so flawed? This thought is the seed of dissent. Dissent is the expression of opinions that are at odds with those officially or officially held. In the 1360s, dissent was growing like a weed in the cracks of the church's foundation. The second wave of 1361 had a specific, terrible effect on the church. Chroniclers tell us it killed a huge number of bishops, abbots, and experienced priests. These were the men who stayed behind to give the last rites to the dying children. Because they did their duty, they died. Who was left? Often it was the cowards who fled, or the ambitious men who bought their positions. So, the second pestilence created a crisis of competence. Competence is the ability to do something successfully or efficiently. The church lost its competence, and the people noticed. This brings us to Oxford University. In the halls of Oxford, a brilliant theologian named John Wycliffe was watching this collapse. He saw the corruption. He saw the wealth of the church while the people suffered. Wycliffe began to ask dangerous questions. Does a corrupt priest still have the power to forgive sins? Does the Pope have authority if he does not live like Jesus? These questions were revolutionary. We use the word heresy. Heresy is belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religious doctrine. In the 1360s, these ideas were whispering on the edge of heresy. But Wycliffe was not just a rebel. He was a voice for the voiceless. He attacked what we call hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. The church preached poverty, but lived in luxury. Wycliffe pointed his finger at this hypocrisy. He argued that the true church was not the building or the gold. It was the community of believers. This idea terrified the establishment. Why? Because the church was the biggest landowner in England. If you question their spiritual authority, you also question their right to collect taxes, tithes. The plague of 1361 to 1362 had stripped away the glamour of the institution. It revealed the rot underneath. And it wasn't just the intellectuals. The common people began to tell jokes about the friars. They sang rude songs about the bishops. Satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices. The English literature of the late 14th century is full of satire against the church. It was a safety valve for their anger. But safety valves only work for a while. Eventually, the pressure gets too high. The years following 1362 were a time of ferment. Ferment usually refers to the chemical breakdown of a substance, like grapes turning into wine. But in history, it means agitation and excitement among a group of people. England was in a state of ferment. The survivors of the second wave were not just lucky, they were hardened. They had looked death in the face twice. They were less afraid of hell. If the priest could not save their children, why listen to the priest? If the Lord could not protect their village, why serve the Lord? The mental chains were breaking. We have seen the biological shock, the economic shift, the legal battle, and now the spiritual doubt. But what happens when you combine all these ingredients? You get a recipe for revolution. The Children's Plague of 1361 was the final push that set England on a collision course. We will see how the trauma of 1361 changed the concept of Englishness forever. A yeoman is a man holding and cultivating a small landed estate, a freeholder. Not a noble, but not a slave. The yeoman is the hero of the New England, and he's ready to stand his ground. We heard the whispers of religious rebellion. Now, in Part 9, we watch a new figure emerge from the dust. He stands in a field that used to belong to 3 different families. Now, it belongs to him alone. He wears a tunic of good wool. On his back, he carries a longbow made of yew wood. He is not a knight, he is not a lord, but he is no longer a starving peasant. He is a yeoman. This is a word you must know to understand English history. Yeoman. A yeoman is a man holding and cultivating a small landed estate, a freeholder. He owns his land, or he rents enough of it to be independent. He answers to the law, but he does not grovel in the dirt. The Children's Plague of 1361 created the yeoman. How? By killing the competition. The second wave cleared the board. It removed the surplus population. It allowed the survivors to combine small strips of land into larger, more profitable farms. Consolidation is the action or process of combining a number of things into a single, more effective or coherent whole. The survivors consolidated their power. They took the empty fields. They fenced them in. They switched from growing just enough wheat to survive to raising sheep for wool to sell. This shift from survival to profit changed the English character. It created a spirit of autonomy. Autonomy is the right or condition of self-government, freedom from external control or influence. He had survived the wrath of God and the failure of the king. He realized that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. This is where the famous English stiff upper lip begins to form. It is not just about being tough. It is about being self-reliant in a world that wants to kill you. In the 1360s, these men became the backbone of the nation. Remember the longbow on his back? The king needed these men. The nobility had been decimated by the plague. The old feudal levies were unreliable, so the crown turned to the yeomanry to fight its wars in France. They were paid wages. They were respected. They were dangerous. This is a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is a fundamental change in approach or underlying assumptions. Before the plague, the assumption was, the rich fight, the poor work. After the plague, the paradigm shifted. The survivor fights, and the survivor gets paid. But this new strength came with a heavy psychological price. The yeoman knew that his prosperity was built on a graveyard. He walked over the bones of his neighbors every day. This created a sense of impermanence. Impermanence is the state or fact of lasting for only a limited period of time. The people of the late 14th century knew that the good times could end in a heartbeat. The plague was not over. It was just sleeping. They lived in a state of flux. Flux means continuous change. In 1361, they learned that the disease was cyclical. It would come back every 10 or 12 years. It would take the children. It would take the old. So they adapted. They built better houses, stone instead of wood, to keep out the rats. They ate better food to keep up their strength. They married later, because they wanted to be sure they had enough land to support a family that might die young. The second pestilence taught them that resilience is not a one-time act, it is a lifestyle. Resilience is not just bouncing back, it is rebuilding the wall stronger every time it gets knocked down. By the end of the 1360s, England was richer per person than it had ever been. But it was also quieter. The great festivals were smaller. The villages were shrinking. The forests were growing back, reclaiming the edges of civilization. We used the phrase, to hold the line. To hold the line means to not yield to the pressure of a difficult situation. The yeoman held the line. He stood between the chaos of the plague and the order of civilization. He refused to let the forest take his farm. He refused to let the despair take his mind. But he was changed. He was no longer the obedient servant of 1340. He was a man who knew his worth. And he was armed. This new class, the yeomanry, would go on to shape the future of England. They would demand a parliament that listened to them. They would spark the Peasants' Revolt a few years later, in 1381. But that is a story for another time. For now, we stand in 1362. The second wave has finally retreated. The graves are filled. The fences are moved. The laws are written in English. The crisis is over, but the aftermath is just beginning. We will look at the entire picture of the second plague. We will answer the ultimate question. Did the plague actually save the survivors? we will summarize the English vocabulary of disaster. And we will see how the year 1361 proved that the end is rarely a clean line in history. We saw a new class of Englishmen rising from the ashes, armed with autonomy and longbows. Now we reach the end of our journey through the dark years of 1361 and 1362. We began this series with a question: why did the plague return? We learned that it returned because immunity is not forever. It returned because a new generation of children was vulnerable. It returned because the bacteria never really left. This brings us to the final, most important concept of this documentary: endemic. In the beginning, the Black Death was an epidemic. An epidemic is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease. It comes, it kills, and, we hope, it leaves. But by 1362, the plague had become endemic. Endemic means regularly found among particular people or in a certain area. The plague became a permanent resident of England. It settled into the soil. It settled into the rats. It settled into the fears of the people. For the next 300 years, the plague would return. Again, and again, and again. Whatever normal life was before 1348, it was gone forever. The new normal included the constant shadow of death. But here is the final paradox. Out of this shadow came a brighter light than anyone expected. The second pestilence of 1361 was a tragedy, yes. It took the children. It took the Duke of Lancaster. It emptied the schools. But it also broke the chains of the feudal system. Because labor was scarce, the survivors became freer. Because the old priests died, new ideas like Wycliffe's could grow. Because the French-speaking nobles died, the English language could rise. We call this a legacy. A legacy is something left or handed down by a predecessor. The legacy of the plague was not just graves. It was the modern English nation. It was a nation of people who were skeptical of authority, self-reliant and fiercely independent. They learned that the king could not save them. They had to save themselves. And they did. They rebuilt the population. They built the great perpendicular churches that still stand today. Light, airy and defiant against the darkness. They took the broken pieces of their world and forged something stronger. This is the ultimate lesson of history. The end is rarely a clean line. Wars do not end the treaty is signed. The trauma lingers in the soldiers. Plagues do not end the day the dying stops. The grief shapes the next generation. History is messy. It is a series of overlapping waves. So, the next time you hear about a post-pandemic world, remember 1361. Remember the children's plague. Remember that recovery is not a straight line. It is a spiral. We circle back to the pain. We are more scarred, but we are also more resilient. Thank you for walking these gritty streets with me. You have learned the language of recurrence, resurface, lingers. You have learned the language of society, upstart, yeoman, lawlessness. You have seen that even in the darkest winter of 1361, the seeds of the future were being sown. The plague is gone now, but the people it forged are still here. The speakers of this resilient, stubborn, beautiful English language are still here. And that is the greatest victory of all.